Sorry, we've just got loads of events on, so we just came for one. So first thing to say is thank you so much for coming. Thanks to Gallery Photography, amazing venue, amazing partners. But this is the Bealtaine Festival, which I hope all of you will know, and we're Ireland's only festival which is about celebrating the arts and creativity as we age. And it's very much about our stories, gathering our stories as we get older, in preparation, if you like, for being older. But this festival is our first hybrid festival, so it's online and offline events. This is obviously offline. We're really excited about it. And so all I'm going to do now is, other than thank the Arts Council and HSE, who are our funders, is hand over to Monica Flynn, who is the curator with Francis Bay behind this amazing project, Flikkers. Thanks, Monica.
Thanks, Sarah. I've been, I suppose, working with Francis Bay, who's just right here, and Tonie Walsh, who you're going to get to hear from shortly, on this series of events. And I suppose it arose out of a discussion in last year's Bealtaine about spaces for older LGBT folk to dance and be ourselves. And I suppose Brandon sort of introduced the whole kind of history of Flikkers, and I suppose Tonie immediately sprang to mind in terms of I suppose having lived that history and being really involved in the activism and journalism around that time as well. And I suppose this series of events has really come together out of partnerships in the community. So, for example, Hannah Kieran is here to give interviews today, and Hannah and GCN have covered this series of events really well, and really delighted to work with them, and delighted to be asked by Trish and Brendan to be part of this exhibition protest in gallery photography as well. So Brendan has curated the LGBT strand of this exhibition and drawn on some of Tonie's personal archive of photographs for this. So we're looking forward to the discussion, and I'll hand over to Brendan Maher.
Thanks, Monica.
Hello everybody, just welcome to the talk today. It's part of the Bealtaine Festival, and specifically the Flikkers Come As You Are subsection of the Bealtaine Festival, a series of events remembering and celebrating Flikkers Disco at the Hirschfeld Centre and the generation who made things happen. Our talk today will be on Subversive Signs. It's a discussion with myself and Tonie. I don't think Tonie needs an introduction, but I will also give you an introduction, Tonie. Tonie has been quite a figure within the LGBT movement for many years. I have a list here, I'll just quickly go through. During the 80s, he was a significant player in the Hirschfeld Centre. He was a DJ. He was the founding editor of GCN magazine. In 1985, he was the first openly gay person to compete is the wrong word, but to what's the word?
Stand for election.
Stand for election, that's it. For the Dublin City Council.
Without success, but anyway.
It doesn't matter, he still did it under Glenn Maher, the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network. He's further president of the National LGBT Federation, and just last year he was a co-curator with the NLI on a photographic exhibition of Christopher Robson's images. Cool. So, we'll start with the Hirschfeld Centre. How did you get involved with the Hirschfeld Centre?
Well, before I answer that, I want to make the observation here to everyone about some of the images we're going to talk about. And Brendan and I were riffing on this earlier on, how we struggled to find a really good representative sample of social ephemera, queer social ephemera. Because actually there's very little of it in the public domain. I mean, this isn't a criticism of the National Library of Ireland, which hosts the Irish Queer Archive, which I was intimately involved with for nearly 3 decades. But the collections like social ephemera, I'm talking about postcards and posters and photographs and badges, banners, stickers. It's such in terms of the IQA, it's an enormous and complex collection. How you go about actually preserving it, conserving it, and digitizing it is a massive issue, and it's something that Francis and I talked about much as we were putting some of the elements of the Fabulous Flikkers program together. So I just want to make that note that actually we did struggle to get some of that material. It's just simply not, it hasn't been digitized. And in fact, it's the hard copies, apart from sort of duplicates that I might have or other people might have stashed away in their attics, are languishing in a storage facility out in Whitehall or whatever. And I suppose my point of bringing this up is say for anyone who's got skin in the game or feels we need to put a value on social ephemera, and that's another issue as well. There are many people in Irish society, even statutory bodies, that just would be quick to dismiss the value of social ephemera and the record of what that represents. People going out, as Brendan and I mentioned Brendan earlier on, I'm thinking about LGBT people going out and, to quote Mark 7, being exuberant in the face of oppression is a profoundly political thing to do. And the documentary evidence of that is really important, that we find a way to actually collate, corral that material, preserve it and put it to the use of Irish society. I just hope that you'd take that notion away with you today, that we, in our conversations with people and museum keepers and archivists and librarians and other people who've got access to this material or who are interested in it, to put a value on it and to find a way of actually bringing it into the public domain.
I think we'll come back to that towards the end of the talk, just about perhaps the marginal nature or the perception of the marginal nature of those objects and how they were treated by the archives. Maybe the financial requirements, necessary to digitise and make public and to put online. We'll speak to that in a little bit. So how did you get involved in the Hirschfeld Centre? We start just there, and your time as a DJ, and who went to Flikkers? Who were the audience first of all?
I walked into Flikkers, and I'll never forget it, in September 1979. It was heat-waved summer in Dublin, all over Europe. And I was just back, I'd just come out in Amsterdam. I arrived back just shy of my 19th birthday, and it was a revelation walking into the place. First of all, because it was the first place where I saw two women and two guys dancing together to a slow set. It was quite one of the most subversive, transformative and radical things I'd ever witnessed as a sort of young gay man trying to sort of make sense of my sexuality at a time when there were very few markers in mainstream Irish society. I didn't have the language. Because I was Dutch, I immediately understood what the word Flikkers meant, faggots. And in Dutch, then and now, it is a really derogatory term. You just do not use it. It's even more derogatory than using the word faggot. If you say flicker up to somebody, it's an extremely abusive term in the Dutch language. And I found it extraordinary that the founders of the Hirschfeld Centre, one of them is here with us today, Edmund Lynch. I found it extraordinary that the founders of the National Gay Federation, which established the Hirschfeld Centre, we didn't realise it at the time, but it was one of the earliest of its kind in the world. In fact, it's in the top 10 of comprehensive LGBT community centres established globally in 1979. In terms of the range of services that it tried to provide. But it was making a significant statement, not only in naming the building after an early 20th century German Jewish gay activist, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, most of whose work was destroyed by the Nazis. We're going to come to that again, I think. But also making a statement about naming the building the Hirschfeld Centre, because it was making a statement about patching Irish lesbians and gay men into a wider European dialectic, which is very important to remind us that we weren't alone, that we were part of a tradition that stretched back to the early 20th century, and then upending the legacy of shame and oppression that came with certain terminology like faggots and flickers. And also to homaging the Dutch civil rights movement, which was founded in the 1930s, went underground during the German occupation of the Netherlands. But the COC, again, Flikkers was a sly reference to early 20th century Dutch activism, again patching us into a movement that many people would have been unaware of, especially because Stonewall in 1969 occupies such enormous hegemony when it comes to sort of like thinking about the origins of the modern LGBT civil rights movement.
Okay. Brilliant. And this floor, you were involved in this design yourself?
It came a few years later, and I ran with this, and I got into trouble then, and I suspect I'd get into more trouble now. So I designed this. I didn't design the original logo. That's the swoosh, as I call it. It's a 1985 iteration of the earlier disco, 1979 disco logo. It's much more dynamic. It's using some of the pink triangle in a stark black and white. It was designed by Michael Carmody, a Tipperary graphic designer who later died in his really young, early 30s. And this would have been a teaser for Flikkers from 1986 or 87, and I just decided to make explicit what Flikkers means by actually spelling out faggots and obviously including dykes as well. And I do remember a little bit of pushback from people, and I thought, no, we want to sort of get people's attention here.
Distributing this on the street, what reaction was?
I'm sure some people were appalled, but even some gay people, lesbians would have been appalled but like there's no point in like faffing around.
You were getting to the point.
And listen, there were people who arrived in the Hirschfeld Centre and were conflicted about going to a club that was called Flikkers when they discovered, I mean, it had a nice sort of 70s disco ring to it, but when they discovered what it meant, some people were quite appalled. And they didn't have the patience to parse what was really going on and actually using a term like Flikkers. We're having the same conversation right now around the word queer.
Yeah.
We have been having the same conversation around the use of the word queer since the late 90s.
Next slide. These ones.
Yeah, I wanted you to put this up for two reasons. I'm intrigued by how a club was able to get away with staying open until 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning here. I mean, something inherently subversive about this, but it's also redolent of a time when the Gardaí and the licensing authorities weren't really au fait with ecstasy, which was emerging on the scene at this. 1981, ecstasy hadn't arrived. Ecstasy arrived in the mid-80s. But it's indicative of statutory bodies, and particularly the police, who were reluctant to actually engage with the gays down in either the IGRM in North Rots or the gays in Fownes Street, and the same in Belfast and Cork or wherever. They left us alone to our own devices, but it's also indicative of the deep mistrust and suspicion that existed between the LGBT community and the Gardaí, which would reach its nadir post the murder of Charles Self, the RTE designer, and the balls up of a police investigation following his murder, where it's still open, they haven't caught him, and all he did was actually use his murder to hoover up a load of information, some of it illegally, of gay men in Cork and Dublin, creating a dossier basically to control us and put us in our place. But it's, I'm intrigued. There's a slide referencing to late night closing is a little bit of a fingers up to the licensing authorities. I do also think there's something about the male iconography that irks me a little bit, because it's a reminder too of how gender specific a lot of the iconography of Flikkers was. And you could sort of say, if you're to be generous, you say, well, actually 3/4 of the clientele were gay or bi men. But I'm going, but that doesn't mean that you just simply had to focus your concern on their needs. And I have to say there's a paucity of multi-gender iconography in some of the publicity materials coming out of the Hirschfeld Centre. Some of that would change a little bit from the mid-80s onwards, when you had some really progressive and interesting graphic designers like Des Fox, who also designed for Out magazine. He designed for Out for Ourselves and the Dublin Gay and Lesbian Men's Collective, and he's responsible for a gorgeous, I'm sorry I couldn't get my hands on it for the reasons I mentioned earlier. He designed the Dublin LGBT Pride poster in 1984. It's the first year where the word lesbian has been added to Dublin Gay Pride. But it's also, what's really telling about the poster is it's a non-gender specific graphic that he's using. And it's indicative of a small group of people at the time, men and women, who were already sort of second guessing this stuff. And we're going, no, do you know, we need to sort of we need to be intersectional and we need to be inclusive. But I have to say, there's not enough of it there. I think we have a few more images we might come to later on. But yeah. Well, this is actually really interesting for loads of reasons. Again, the 4 a.m. closing, but I love the juxtaposition of the pink and green triangles. I mean, we've had
a discussion earlier on. We were just the pink triangle. We all know what it means.
Does everyone know what it means? Yes, born out of concentration camps.
And then became a symbol of the movement from West Berlin gay rights liberation organisation in the 70s. 73, they were looking for a logo to represent themselves with, and that coincided with publication of a memoir of a man who had been a homosexual in the camps, and the book title was Men in Pink Triangles, and the cover was the pink triangle. Downward facing, so that was usurped, that was taken over. They used that. I mean, in 8 months that symbol started showing up in New York, London, Miami, and different other groups. And then again in the 80s, the symbol of the pink triangle shifted, and instead of being downward facing, it became upward facing towards AIDS sort of recognition and the workings to around equality and things like that. The green triangle was a representation of criminals within the Nazi concentration things, and then we spoke about black triangles. So
black triangles were anarchists.
Yep.
Red triangles were socialists, communists, and there's very little documentary evidence of lesbians being incarcerated specifically for their sexual orientation. Most of them were incarcerated as anarchists, which now probably a new generation of Irish of lesbians would actually love that their sisters back in the 1940s were shunted off to the death camps for being anarchists. But it's really interesting that James Demare, a Canadian graphic designer who worked on Out magazine, did a small amount of work. And by the way, I should note that a lot of this work for the club was run along, it was a community-based club run along, or tried to achieve a sort of professionalism in its operation, but was all staffed by volunteers. It was a LGBT community centre, and this is also indicative of a time when there was zero statutory funding. And in terms of getting advertising, I mean, you wouldn't sort of get the branding of a drinks company or something on a flyer like that. Good luck to getting. Before decriminalisation, statutory Ireland and the commercial sector in Ireland just ran as far away as possible from the gays. They did not want to have anything to do with us, and that would only begin to shift from 1993 on.
So Flikkers was a way of financing.
It was entirely self-funded, and actually it was the cash cow on which the whole precarious edifice rested on. It funded a women's group, a youth group, Ireland's first lesbian gay youth group, a private 16mm cinema club, which was unheard of at the time. It paid the mortgage. It paid for publications like Identity and Touch, Out magazine, and it paid for administration offices for Dublin Gay Switchboard and the National Gay Federation. It's really, and it's a measure. I mean, now when I think about it, I think it's just a measure of the extraordinary psycho-emotional largesse of people. The fact that the Hirschfeld community centres like the Hirschfeld Centre in Dublin, the other place in Cork, the Carpenter Club in Belfast, all became these reservoirs of human and economic resources. And it's, you know, time and time again, when you look back at our history, you see an embattled community facing the onslaught of awful homophobia from mainstream society, constantly resourcing our survival. It's quite extraordinary. It really is. I mean, it would give me cause to be really bitter if I wanted to be, at the fact that mainstream society just simply ignored our concerns and was unwilling, because we became clouded in criminality and transgressiveness, was unwilling to do things like fund a very necessary youth group or a switchboard service or whatever else, that actually we had to fund all of that from a dance club. But it also gave the dance club that extra level of legitimacy as well, and urgency for people.
Yeah, and a reason to go also as well, besides just to have
you could dance until 8 o'clock in the morning, yeah. Get free coffee and croissants afterwards. Where else were you going to get that?
Free croissants in the morning.
On the late night parties.
Brilliant. the clone ball. This is next one, image next. Can you discuss just a clone, the whole concept of clone ball and that sort of imagery and presentation of gay identity or gay male identity?
This is from 1981 and it's designed by Aidan Bradley, who also did quite a bit of graphic design work for Out magazine later on in the 80s, and he would end up being responsible for designing a significant part of the Dice Man's costumes as well. And I love the playfulness of this. Again, I have to tiptoe around this because I'm going, more male iconography, for crying out loud. But at the same time too, I'm loving the playfulness behind Flikkers actually puncturing the preciousness of sort of butch posturing gay men at the time, the clone ball. And of course it's so meta because you've essentially got, it's referencing that cultural phenomenon of a distinct type of gay men that grew out of San Francisco and New York, that was serving up a notion of masculine identity, that they were first of all subverting mainstream heterosexual masculinity and serving it back to them in the sort of uber butch, we now call them gym bunnies, I suppose. Very playful and puncturing the earnestness, and get a moustache at the door, prize for the least original costume. Yeah, good. And beautiful. This is all before desktop publishing and everything. It's beautifully hand-drawn illustrations.
This doesn't really need to be spoken about, I suppose. It's the iconography of Dorothy's red ruby slippers. We all know the connections with the community and Wizard of Oz. But I think you spoke about negative space and the artifact itself and its history within the history of Hirschfeld Centre, having been survived the fire. So you can just...
I designed this poster inspired by my graphic designer friend Niall Sweeney, who designed the poster for the Halloween Ball the year beforehand, which I think you've got next, haven't you? Yeah. And I love the fact that we've got an 8 a.m. closing time here, 11 p.m. to 8 a.m. closing. This now, although we didn't suspect at the time, comes laden with poignancy because it's the last public event in the Hirschfeld Centre before it's torched by fire. 4 days later, the 9-year-old community centre will be gone. As a stroke, cutting off a major funding stream for all of the various AIDS groups, women's groups, all of the groups using the building. It cut off our social space because we're also talking about the time when the commercial scene as we know it now was just really in its infancy. There just weren't the places there. And also too, there weren't places that weren't predicated, where entrance wasn't predicated on your gender or the amount of money you had or the clothes you were wearing. And you know what, like when we look back at somewhere like the Hirschfeld Centre, I'm not blind to its failings, and it had many. But it was also, I look back on its history with extraordinary fondness and respect for what it tried to achieve. It wasn't perfect, but it certainly tried to muddle through. And I think if it had the time to do it again, it would do it much differently. But we were all sort of just figuring it out at the time. So the poster actually it survived the fire, and you can see there's an echo of the fire because it's literally singed. This is an A2 poster. There's now a copy of it in the National Museum of Ireland, but it was singed all around the edges, amazingly survived the fire. And now actually that negative space you speak of just has a whole other element to it, of symbolism to it.
Many people could fit into that space. Yeah. This is the Niall Sweeney.
This is Niall Sweeney from the year before, and again, it's significantly damaged by smoke. The dance floor and the ground floor of the building were totaled. And incredibly, the top floor of the building, which housed the offices of the National Gay Federation and Gay Health Action and Dublin Gay Switchboard, managed to survive, but were really badly smoke damaged. I mean, for months afterwards, you could smell the smoke from documents that were locked away in filing cabinets. but just the smoke got everywhere. And this is completely stained by, it's not stained by age, it's stained by smoke. And it's extraordinary that we actually managed to hold on to so much materials. In fact, everything that survived became the bedrock of what's now the Irish Queer Archive in the National Library of Ireland.
I think it's interesting, the portrait.
Isn't it?
It's not fully elucidated, like who it is.
Yeah, and again, this is Niall Sweeney. By the way, this is Niall Sweeney's first publicly commissioned piece of work. He was a 19-year-old graphic design student in Dún Laoghaire College of Art, as it was called at the time, and the National Gay Federation, which ran the Hirschfeld Centre. The National Gay Federation commissioned him to commissioned a 19-year-old to do this graphic. He's a really good illustrator, but his obsession is typography. This would have all been hand-drawn lettering. Wow. This would have been letter set, but this is all hand-drawn. It's quite an extraordinary, it's A2, it's quite a beautiful, and I do love the sort of hint, again, like what I was when I was describing the work of Des Fox, hinting at a non-gender specific graphic. When I first saw that, I just immediately thought of Grace Jones, maybe Klaus Nomi, the two people who came to mind. And obviously it speaks carnival, there's some mad little thing hanging off that person's head. Can I say too, one of the things when we look back at some of this work, what's lovely is we also get a sense of some of the beginnings of some illustrators and photographers and graphic designers who are now
very well established
and have a significant body of work, and it's a testament to some of these LGBT organizations. And by the way, I could how much many groups. I see one of my colleagues here from one of the founders of the Dublin Lesbian Gay Men's Collective. But there were many LGBT groups in Ireland at the time who went out of their way to enable and platform the work of young, untried, untested, emerging artists and photographers. Mm-hmm. And we have them to thank that we've actually managed to. I see another person over here who is similarly that we actually have this work.
So would you have within the Irish Queer Archive other examples of even the workings of these? Loads. But again, like as mentioned earlier on, they've yet to be catalogued and digitised.
This
is an interesting one with the inclusion of purple. It's a sort of a lesser known reference to LGBT culture. It's sapphic violet, Sappho's, and her description of Violet's chains around her partner's neck after they separated in a beautiful poem.
It hints at a lot of seediness, I think, as well, actually.
Too, yes.
There's also something to it. It means very resonant of the mid-late 80s. It's by an Italian-Irish graphic designer called Francis Scapitici, who was a clone himself, and he actually worked a lot of his own personal iconography into some of his illustrations. Again, hand-drawn. Most of the typefaces, the typesetting, this is typeset, I suppose this is just letter set. But it also speaks to an emerging, there's a sort of positive visibility and strength of purpose that you see emerging from the mid-80s onwards. Again, to now we have the distance to look back, and we see the 80s. I mean, one of the grimmest decades ever in Ireland in the 20th century. But you see the LGBT community growing in confidence and voice.
Yes.
All over the country, not just in Dublin. But you also see a pushback from the last remaining bigoted rump of old conservative Irish society, and that's manifesting itself in violence, it's manifesting itself in anti-gay murder and whatnot, and also on a reluctance by statutory bodies to give us what we were asking for: decriminalisation, equality legislation. All of that would really only gather steam from the 90s onwards. But you do see the emergence of a very distinctive Irish queer sensibility, represented even both through political posters and social ephemera, and I just think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful.
It's a fantastic imagery. You spoke about the backdrop of the murders, Charles Self and Declan Flynn, and Hirschfeld Centre operated throughout that time. As well.
This is also we're into the AIDS pandemic at this point as well, you know, and it's a reminder too that even in the face of the awfulness.
We'll move on to album covers next, some of the albums that you provided for the talk. But before we do, the DJs in the Hirschfeld Centre, I've read that predominantly male. There was one female DJ, was there, on occasion? Or?
Izzy Kamikaze played occasionally. With Lesbian Liberation for Irish Lesbians organised a separate women's night on Thursday, which later moved to Wednesday. And they needed to do it because actually it was a recognition that Irish lesbians were doubly oppressed, obviously by virtue of their gender and sexuality, and needed a space free of men. And it's quite extraordinary. Can I just something about the lingering sexism in certain quarters at the time too, that there were some gay men who were just really ungenerous in even allowing women to have one bloody night a week on their own when they had access to the building 6 nights a week. It's some of us all realised it was a bad deal even then. But yes, all of the DJs volunteered their time and they were rewarded with coffee and a free taxi home.
And a croissant at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Where was the music purchased? Where did you?
We had a record pool, so we had a budget of, if my memory serves me right, 50 punts a week, which is a lot of money. And there were certain in-groups within. I mean, the DJ collective was quite competitive. But there were certain DJs, if they were eagle-eyed enough, would actually just get the money and then run off to Beat Records over in the Abbey Mall, which was one of the few places that was importing really good 12 inches. Run over to Beat Records or Golden Discs and pick up some choice tunes. But we also have subscriptions to DJ-friendly edits from the United States, where they were mixing maybe 2,000 or 3,000 copies for global distribution.
Okay.
I hung on to a few of them that I'm trying to get into a national cultural institution. They're actually stamped with NGF's logo as well. So, for example, you might get some DJ-friendly edit of the Pointer Sisters, I'm So Excited. It's 11 minutes long or whatever. Ideal for playing at 4 o'clock in the morning. And you're getting it 6 months before it's even entered the mainstream, if you're even lucky. And then off the dance floor was literally a cupboard. You walked in and it was floor-to-ceiling records, all colour-coded by month. Going back to after the fire, it just broke up. I made public that I was going out and I was deliberately holding on to 50 records that I regarded as redolent of the Flikkers sound, and I don't care who has them; they can take them from me. I'm not precious about keeping them, but I wanted to preserve them as a historical artifact. I don't know where all the other records went. I mean, now they'd be worth a significant amount of money, and they'd be a significant historical resource. But it was like hundreds of 45s and 12-inch singles, going back to the very first 12-inch single, which I think was ever in Champagne King's Shame, 1975 maybe. The best of New York disco and funk. The best of British pop, the best of British electronica, Pet Shop Boys, Depeche Mode, Erasure, whatever, all of that. And then you're into proto house, house music, deep house, some hip hop. And it meant, DJs were free to actually play their own music, but it meant also, because people were volunteering, and it was the bloody 80s, nobody had any money. So it meant that you had easy access to tunes. There wasn't a deliberate ploy to sort of create a Flickr sound, but inevitably, by osmosis and everything, if you've got access to tunes, some DJs are going to end up playing the same tunes because they're just, over different nights or whatever.
So you mentioned you'd have up to 6 months potentially before tracks make it to the mainstream.
Yeah, and that was very important, Brendan, because it also gave the club that extra level of agency that was required to just sort of keep it in the frame.
Yeah, and did you find members of the straight community coming to the club for the music as well?
Oh my God, we had straight DJs who actually ended up DJing in the club, like Paul Webb, who later made a name. I mean, there's some Flikkers actually seeded a group of DJs who later went on to do terrific things inside Dance Club, which opened up on St. Bridget's Day in 1986 and is now regarded as not only one of the earliest commercial clubs of its time, but also Ireland's first commercial gay club, and Ireland's first mixed commercial straight dance club.
Okay.
And I doubt if it would have opened as quickly as it did. And again, it's emblematic of the growing confidence of the LGBT community that a Kerry man was able to take a punt on a site, on a high street site like Dame Street, and then, well, fronted onto Dame Street and Dame Lane, and open up this New York style dance club. I mean, it was a revelation when it opened. It was torched, by the way, if anyone is interested in dance club history. It was torched a week after the Hirschfeld Centre was destroyed in unproven circumstances, and never regained quite its same level of agency. Its founder, John Nolan, would later die of AIDS complications in 1985, and his manager, Ken Kelly, would die of AIDS complications the day before him. In fact, several of the staff all died of AIDS complications.
This album here, Theo Vanis, where did this come into your life, and what attracted you to the cover? It's
a Dutch producer, and he's producing high energy music for a mainly specific gay male audience that was emerging. This is from 1976, 77, that was coming of age in San Francisco, in large urban centres, San Francisco and New York, and later on in Dublin, London. But I love the sneaky bottle of poppers that's meant to look like a lipstick or something there, but you know it's not a lipstick that he's holding. And again, too, the coded reference to sort of cruising and, transgressive behaviour. We have to remember too that, this is not long after Stonewall. People forget what was happening in Stonewall and why LGBT people got so stroppy when the cops raided the Stonewall Inn. People were dancing in the Stonewall Inn. And same-sex couples dancing together in 1969, as in many other parts of the world, right up until the late 70s. Same-sex couples dancing together was not only socially transgressive and enormously taboo, it was a criminal behaviour. Mm-hmm. It was criminal for two men to dance together or kiss or hold hands in public or in private in Ireland until 1993. So you can understand how important it was to create these, I hate the term safe space, it's a bit contested, but creating these peer-mediated spaces where people feel free to slough off their oppression and sort of feel some level of normalcy where they can then begin to imagine a brighter future for themselves. These spaces are really important, whether it's like a community-run space like the Hirschfeld Centre, or it could be a queer sock in Trinity College or whatever, that's having a coffee morning. But these social spaces are hugely important to enabling the conversations that then lead us to sort of bigger things. And there's a bit of a shift here. So we're talking about the last album cover is 76, and then the Boys Town Gang, produced by a defiantly openly gay record label in San Francisco over a decade later, is emblematic of that cultural shift that's happened, and again that the newfound sense of confidence and visibility and vocalism that you're finding, and it's finding its way into, it's not just political posture, it's finding its way into graphically designed images of gay male sensibility.
Photographs of Herb Britt and people like that.
And being unapologetic about it too, which was incredibly refreshing.
And then
the album was banned actually because they produced a 12-inch with a big high-energy version of Ain't No Mountain High Enough, and on the flip a track called Cruising the Streets that's basically spoken word to a thumping beat of two guys negotiating sex in some shady lane in San Francisco, and the record was banned all over the place.
Even within this quite overtly homosexual cover, there's a subversive sign of the strapped metal around the arm, or the leather strap, indication of S&M and things like that as well.
It's such a fabulous cover, isn't it?
It's so simple, it's so striking, black, white, and a bit of colour in the middle, and the use of the pink triangle as well. Really interesting album. The inlay of the album, it's not very legible. This is a little section here. Gave the age of consent throughout the world. I suppose 21 was the age in England. There was sort of a partial decriminalisation in the 60s. 21, you could still not book a hotel room to have sex with a man. You couldn't book a hotel together because that was still illegal. So there's a partial decriminalisation, and this is to bring attention that the age of consent in other countries was lower. So they included it on the album sleeve. But when the album was released in America, it was after a few months they removed that section because it was affecting album sales. So there's still that sort of level of this. When you had albums on here,
it was so defiant, Brendan. Can you remember the first time you came across this album cover?
I would have been in my brother's collection when I would have been 8 or 9. He's also a gay man, so he's 8 years older, so it would have been part of his collection.
Okay.
So I would have heard the songs like Small Town Boy, things like that. As a young kid, sort of playing, but not understanding.
I mean, it's taking no hostages. Then and now, a little bit like the Pink Triangle, it still has such wonderful agency. And of course, too, locating it in the time when Margaret Thatcher's Tory government had introduced was just about to introduce, they were talking about it, Section 28 of the Local Government Act that outlawed any form of promotion of male or female homosexuality in the education system, which not only meant that it prevented LGBT teachers from being open in work, but it actually criminalised any conversation around gayness by teachers, and it erased any funding opportunities for LGBT community groups by statutory bodies, and the law will become a template for Putin, whatever, less than 20 years later. I mean, you think about it, it's a little bit like the US war on terror. How can you go to war on a concept? How can you outlaw a concept? It's quite extraordinary.
And it's just done in Florida again?
Yes, and Poland have taken a leaf out of the same book, and Hungary. But it's such a strong graphic, and it was very brave of the boys, and only fitting that they actually.
Well, they continued that bravery even with the music videos. They didn't hold back. It was
and actually, Frankie Goes to Hollywood were of a piece as well. Erasure as well. And you do see. I mean, Britpop is having its moment, and queer Britpop is really having its moment from that time onwards, and involving being unapologetic about political posturing as well. Yeah. I mean, not every pop star can actually carry it off. Just ask Bono. But it is actually. It is really interesting.
The next cover is a single from this album. It's the third single they released, It Ain't Necessarily So, and it's quite clear Dorothy, the Wizard of Oz. Why do you think Dorothy's head was changed for the devil's head, a goat's head?
I don't know, maybe you can answer that?
Yeah, I don't know. It's I was just looking at it yesterday. It was a strange... again, you have the purple going around the background.
I'm more intrigued by a proud out gay man, what's his face, lead singer, Jimmy Somerville, actually taking a song like It Ain't Necessarily So, which was, all the best versions of it, are the leading versions of it that are in the American songbook, are all sung by women. and it's usually sung from a woman's point of view, actually. And here's the gay man actually sort of running with it. It's a gorgeous, smoky, jazzy tune.
Next one. Sylvester, very interesting story for this album. I suppose, background to Sylvester, he started as a gospel choir singer with his local church. The church asked him to leave, and then he became involved with black cross-dressing and transgender groups in LA, the Disco Taze, and they released music, had a tour, didn't go very well, and became part of another group called the Coquettes. And they didn't do so successfully. I went towards a solo career, and this is the first album cover of his solo career. Fantasy Records in 1977. I'll let Tonie speak about Sylvester. We have 3 albums to show here for this particular artist.
Well, of course, you need to be living in a rock not to know who Sylvester James was. He died of AIDS complications way too young, the age of 41 in 1988. But we now rightly regard him as a pioneer. First of all, for being an openly proud gay pop star, but also for his gender fluidity and for engaging and constantly using the platform of his fame and stage to engage in gender fuck. Of course, his work with the Coquettes was a specific, a beautiful example of that. But he was told to tone down his imagery by Harvey Fouquet, who ex-Motown producer who set up Fantasy Records, and just told him that his work, and at this point he was already, you got a sense that he was on the run to fame and glory in 77, yes, in 77. But he was told to tone down. He wanted to have something that was either in full drag or something that actually just was more androgynous. That was his thing. And also he was very much about making political statements, because of course he's part of this burgeoning scene in San Francisco. He'd come from LA. And he was told to damp it down. It was only after the success of You Make Me Feel Mighty Real 2 years later, well, it came out the following year, but then just made him a megastar, that he was actually able to get his way.
Well, even within this album cover, he still incorporates the use of flower, which in the American sort of terminology from the 1920s, agricultural boys, flower boys, pansies, and daisies, buttercup. These flowers were sort of symbols of gay culture within America at that stage, and we use it as a term of derogatory.
He's pushing the envelope there a little bit, and it's hard to imagine just how transgressive it was for somebody like Sylvester to be this out proud black gay man. Where he's upending a whole load of institutional black assumptions.
Christian throughout his life.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
That's also.
Yeah. By the way, You Make Me Feel Mighty Real, for any music geeks in the room, grew out of a small gospel riff that he did, and there's on the only live album he recorded in San Francisco War Memorial Opera House. It's a double. I wish there was a video of that performance.
That's still with Fantasy Records.
Yeah, he actually dropped acid before the concert, and they delayed the opening just to make him sort of come down a little bit before he went on stage. He went on stage with the 2 Tons of Fun, later the Weather Girls, who he'd signed in a year before this, 76, and a string orchestra, a concert orchestra, and several backing singers, and he does a slow version of You Make Me Feel Mighty Real with exquisite harmony by the Weather Girls. That was just, it's spine-tingling. It's absolutely spine-tingling song.
After that album, he transferred to... Well, this is the second album.
This is the second album, and still he didn't get his way, because in the biography that was published by him many years later, the man deserves, he really deserves a big biopic. He was still told that's as far as he got. a little bit sort of fey posturing there, a very studied piece of footwear, kicking a cocktail glass. But he was also told that they just weren't prepared to actually, rather than actually put an image of him in drag, he opted out of actually having him. I think there's the next image. It's him on the. No, then we've moved on to 82 now. So there's a jump. You can see when you move on to the next image. Do you want a funk? And he's still actually being really playful here and transgressive. At a time too when a lot of black gay men, black and bi and trans gay men were just doubly oppressed by the white mainstream as much as their brothers within the black American community.
And he's including the heritage as well as like black Africans heritage as well.
He was an extraordinary, apart from the fact his musical prowess and his political activism, he was extraordinary in terms of the posturing he engaged in and his deliberate attempt to puncture all our preconceptions around male identity and gay male identity.
Yep. The next image is my choice, just to put aside that. So again, it's gender non-conformance, but it's of an early period, 81. So Grace Jones, the short hair, the masculine clothes, and the sense of androgyny, and you notice the purple as well is visible in this, the sapphic violet. And just a fantastic musician.
Her husband, her lover, and later husband, and in fact she says in Bambi and Bambi and whatever the biopic's called, Bambi and yeah, she says thanks. She says that Jean-Paul Goude, the French designer and filmographer, was the only man she ever loved. They had one child together who actually performs with her. But she also it's quite extraordinary. I mean, when she was this album, it's one of my favourite. It was the first album I bought actually in 1981, along with I can't remember the other one, but anyway, she got pushback in certain areas, Grace did. I mean, she's a very specific taste for lots of people because she frightens some people with her uncompromising
herself
non-binary imagery. She's hugely playful, and she did actually say in the same film that actually some of the studied aggressive posturing that she engages with on stage, banging a drumstick like this and everything, is actually her letting go of the abuse that she and her gay brother got from her father. And also her really making a statement about notions of sort of toxic masculinity that she obviously has a problem with.
Peter Allen, I'll let you tell his story, a fascinating story.
Well, you tell the story much better, I think.
Australian man, discovered, for want of a better word, by Judy Garland's husband at a concert, introduced him to Judy Garland. She decides to take him on tour, brings him to the States. He was part of a group last night, the Allen brothers. They go on tour with Judy Garland in the States for a number of years, and she introduces him to her daughter, Liza Minnelli. They marry in 1967, divorce in 1970 when he opens up about his homosexuality. Separate in 1970 and divorce in 74 when he meets his new partner, and they stay together until 84 when his partner dies, and then he dies of AIDS-related complications in 92.
They both died of AIDS-related complications, actually, yes. Yeah. And now he's revered as a major Australian icon.
Hugh Jackman has played in
oh my God, enormous
films about him as well. But why have you included this image today?
Well, one, because the boy next door, says everything. It's what he's playing with here, you know. He was huge with heterosexual suburban housewives and an element of Australian society that would just had a problem with out proud.
Their initial originator modelled on the Everly Brothers for that type of audience.
Absolutely. But he never, when the time came to be out about his sexuality, he didn't flinch about it. Or I don't think he might have been a bit more private about his health status. But he didn't back away like many others did of his stature. I mean, he was just huge, you know, and many people, you just think of Elton John, delayed actually coming out for a long time because they thought it would hurt his career. But not only did he come out, but he decided, you know what, I'm actually going to take the piss as well. I am not that boy next door, even though you've taught it for the last 2 decades.
And just reclining on the piano as well, I just think it's a humorous element to
This is our last slide, I think.
I think so. We have one more after this.
Oh, good.
2 that are of similar nature. So it's imagination, just an illusion.
Well, lots of people actually didn't realise that imagination were composed of a group of gay British black men, and again, when their first album was 81 or 82, I think, and it was huge. It was part of that sort of emerging, what people call street soul, bump and grind, R&B. This is later. I think this is a compilation album.
It's a compilation.
Yeah, but I think their first stuff, their Spotty Talk came out, the single and the album in 81, and they were immediately a huge success. But it's quite extraordinary how
they came from the club scene.
They came from the club scene, and yet they were quite playful and verging on coy about their sexual orientation. I think if you'd interviewed them, I remember interviewing them, they would say the same thing as Neil Tennant did from Pet Shop Boys, that actually their sexual orientation was sitting in plain sight all the time. They just felt they never had to wear it on their sleeve, or else they were just a little bit more sophisticated. You could say the same thing with Andrew Bell from Erasure. And it was only when the push came to call with something like anti-gay legislation in the United Kingdom, where many gay pop stars like George Michael decided to stand up and that should be counted. But they were also, I think they would have actually I would imagine that if it had been known by the mainstream that they were 3 gay black men, a whole load of their target audience would have just dropped them like a hot potato.
I read an interview where they were discussing their appearances on Top of the Pops. No matter where they were in Europe, Top of the Pops, anytime they were in the charts, they were insisted that they had to be in the studio to perform, because their exuberance and the campness of their costumes would bring a certain group of people to the audience that would enliven the show and increase the ratings. So it was so they actually, their display of their homosexuality, even though it was some ways hidden, would increase the numbers of viewership.
It's a bit ridiculous, Brendan, too, because we're talking about the period that's where I hate the term gender bending is actually running rife. I think the Daily Mail coined the term gender bending, and it means quite a derogatory and actually homophobic descriptor. But yes, that the new romantics are having their moment in Britpop, and boys wearing mascara and women playing with butch posturing women are having a moment in the music industry in Britain, and with great success. So you'd imagine if they're riding the coattails of that they might have been able to sort of get away with it. But it just shows you, like, in some quarters, there's still that resistance.
Still resistance. Yeah. So it's the last album cover. So this, again, it's one who's supplied deep beats, high energy classics. I don't know, it's not very visible here, but this is a male torso. Shoulder. This is the nipple area, arm over here. So it's, again, going back. So it's just, again, just using the male physique, I suppose, as a...
And too, also a reflection too of the need in circumstances where gay male desire is constantly negated by mainstream society. In gay female lesbian desires also been negated by mainstream society. But at a time and place when that desire is, and images of that desire are constantly being negated or derided or devalued, it was really important to try and push through that wall of resistance. And even something like, you can actually cynically say, well, it's sort of objectifying. Do we need that sort of sexual objectification? But it was also really important to posit, to platform positive images of lesbian sexuality, lesbian desire, and gay male desire. You could say it's still important to do that.
Yeah. The album itself is an act of remembrance, I suppose. It is a compilation of various artists from the club scene of the early 80s, 90s, and in some ways it's festival. The Flikkers, looking back, as an act of remembrance. And so, can you speak just for what else will be happening this week with Flikkers? What other events are organised? And
sure. Well, this evening, Francis Fay, my pal Francis Fay, there has curated a really gorgeous run until the end of the month. Francis is a well-known visual artist and performance artist, and he put a call out a few months ago through GCN and other quarters for people to contribute material to this exhibition, and I have actually also loaned him some work of Sean Martin, which you feature upstairs in the photographic exhibition. And there are flyers from, what few flyers and publicity aids from Flikkers are in the public domain. Most of them I scanned because it's just been so hard to get access to the hard copies. So he's put together, I just got off a plane yesterday and walked into Outhouse and had a moment when I saw some of the stuff up, because much of this stuff has not been seen in public before.
Yeah, there's the colour photographs.
Yeah, there's photographs from Tonie O'Shea, and again they've got an added poignancy because the photographs are almost all the photographs are taken, apart from a few from the early 80s, are taken from the last public events in the building, literally a few days before the building is irrevocably destroyed by fire. And the fire, I have to say too, it wasn't just the initial damage that it did to opportunity, but it also set back the development of a new LGBT community centre Outhouse by almost a decade. I mean, the government, the National Lottery refused to give us money to rebuild the Hirschfeld Centre because we were criminals, and also because LGBT people just didn't figure in their estimation in 1991. So yeah, it's the exhibition is evocative for all of those reasons, but it's also Francis is going to explain this better this evening at the launch, and you're all welcome. But it's also all of the other material that he's thrown together are evocative of and speak to a particular time and place when a community, a very embattled community, was trying to claim its space in Irish society. And literally building its own dance floors and own social spaces because the commercial sector wasn't providing them for us. And they were really important. They were important for us, especially as a bulwark against the violence that people experience, but also against the brutality of the AIDS pandemic. So the exhibition run goes up this evening at 6 o'clock. It'll stay up for 2 weeks. Then we have tomorrow in the Gallery of Photography, Han Tiernan here from the Project Art Centre. I beg your pardon.
Just right.
Han Tiernan is going to chair a panel discussion drawn from a representative sample of older men and women from Dublin and Cork, that will look at historicising some of these community centres that they may have had personal experience of, but also asking some questions about, as Monica said earlier on, asking some really urgent questions about the choices facing us right now. You know, that I know I speak for many of I'm 62, I speak for many LGBT people of my generation and also for heterosexual men and women who have decided that heteronormativity is not their thing. But I speak for a certain generation who fought for the choice. We fought for certain choices about how we socialise. The platforms we create for our friendships, how we meet, our meeting places, the places that are comfortable for us to have conversations about building a new republic, about creating a more tolerant society, a more inclusive society. We fought long and hard for those choices, following on from Irish feminism, which was doing the same thing in the early 70s. And it's been really important after making those choices and having that battle that we can actually claim some of it as we grow older, because we are invisible. And by the way, I'm getting emotional, but this is not me being bitter or anything. I'm just making an observation that you reach a certain age, and good luck to you then if your age and a disability, you've got a disability on top of that, you are just considered you're jettisoned on the scrap heap, over a certain age.
Yeah.
I'm officially old, I'm 62, and I'm going in here and here, I still feel 27. I don't want to be 27, but anyway, but it is important that we have these conversations, and I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion tomorrow I don't think an hour's enough, but GCN is going to be live streaming it. It's really important that we talk about the choices available to us and what we can do.
As we age.
Pardon?
The choice available as we age.
The choice available to us as we age, and also ask some questions about what Irish society needs to do right now to be that little bit more inclusive. Particularly of the demographic. If I was born in the 60s, that demographic bulge, we call it the demographic bulge from the mid-60s to the mid-70s. We have that demographic bulge now growing older and going, we may not necessarily want to go to the pub and the club every evening, but we still want to go out and socialise, and we still want to sort of feel fulfilled in the cultural and social choices that we make. And the friendships that we continue creating until we die as well. All of these things are really important, and we need to have those conversations. And I'm delighted that Bealtaine has chosen us to actually find ways to do that. That we're going to finish the Fabulous Flikkers Come As You Were programme next week with a tea dance in Imma. It's ticketed, but it's free, and it's running from 6 to 9 on Friday the 20th. And
not till 8 a.m.
No, but we're all going to excitedly, when those of us who've got energy are going to excitedly run down to the church on Mary Street, and we've got a group of original Flikkers DJs playing until 3 o'clock in the morning, along with the Wild Geese. Has anyone seen the Wild Geese? They're an amazing queer cabaret group. The Wild Geese are going to be doing a short cabaret piece as well. And I also think too, where so these are our static, fixed events, but I think
Francis
and Paddy Fagan, but I think the exhibition, I just really want to flag the exhibition, because the exhibition is also meant to be a calling card for triggering people's memories. And Francis and I were saying, I think how the next step would be to start talking about some type of oral history project. I think it's really important. An oral history project around socialization, about the friendships we created, how the various platforms that allowed us to meet each other, and how people found each other, I think is really important. And it's not just about sort of, I'd hate it to just be seen as a vacuous exercise in nostalgia, because it isn't that.
No, absolutely.
It isn't that. But I do think we can apply something from when we look back to how we created these spaces, and how we find each other, and how we were enlivened. We can actually apply something from that process to where we find ourselves now, and ask some cogent questions about why clubs are disappearing in Ireland right now. Or the lack of opportunity in the public realm and all that.
Yeah, and just spaces for older people to age into, I suppose, like retirement homes and spaces like that.
Indeed.
Where we aren't forced into a heteronormative environment, that we're allowed to express ourselves as we express ourselves.
Yeah.
So fantastic.
I realise we've gone over time.
That's it then.
Does anyone? I think we have a little space for a Q&A if anyone has a question or observation they want to make.
I have a question you'd like to make, Tonie?
So just to mention one other event, the Film Commission, the Bealtaine Film Commission, a film called Where You All Old Days Go, is on the 24th of May in the Irish Film Centre. And as part of the Flikkers as well, we have a new film coming in October. Come As You Were by Julianne O'Malley, and Julianne has interviewed several people from Flikkers era who've kind of contributed their memories and experiences since as well. But we hope you join us this evening for 6 o'clock. And also just to say thanks so much to Trish Lamb and Brendan Maher. It's been a really wonderful event, and thanks to Tonie, been really eloquent and insightful, and Brendan was such a really engagingly hosted conversation.
Thank you, man.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you
for coming.
I'd like to say something. I've been going through all the boxes in the Little Museum of Dublin, which is kind of popular museum on Stephen's Green, and I think I only found 1 or 2 gay-related ephemera. One was an invitation to Sides nightclub, and the other was the old cocktail and wine list of Barclay Dunn's 1959.
Wonderful. What they do have, after the Hirschfeld Centre was destroyed, I took the brass plaque home.
They have that on the wall.
And it was gifted to the Little Museum of Dublin, and they have that, and they say it's one of their favourite exhibits. And we took it off the wall because we were just afraid that somebody was going to actually, filch it as a souvenir. It was really important. The story about how. At the time, I think it was. I now look back and I'm going. It's actually an even bigger deal in the distance to think about an Irish LGBT group that made a very deliberate statement about linking us back to the early 20th century in Germany and mainland Europe. Mm-hmm. That sort of commonality of purpose and that intersectionality was really quite. It was quite a statement. It was quite a statement making in 1979.
And it mirrors sort of the statement of using the pink triangle by the West German gay liberation group to use the pink triangle in the 70s, when the laws that put homosexuals in the camps initially were still in place and were still being used. And still also members of the community who had been in the camps were still imprisoned, who had never been let out of prison after the camps were liberated. They were transferred to state prison and stayed there up until the late 70s. So it's quite interesting, that sort of.
By the way, can I just make a quick observation about your what you found in the Little Museum of Dublin? Because it also strikes me that there's still, notwithstanding some of the great efforts that are being made in the National Museum of Ireland in Collins Barracks, the National Library, obviously, and other cultural institutions, that we really need to pressure our national cultural institutions and other cultural bodies to give full expression to notions of diversity and social inclusion, and say, I'm not seeing myself reflected back here. Mm-hmm. My tribes don't see ourselves reflected back here. Now, I'm really hopeful. That process is changing, and it has been ongoing because of statutory change around inclusiveness and everything. And you've got a better generation, a new generation, better educated museum keepers and librarians and archivists and whatnot. But it's, as far as I'm concerned, the pace of change isn't happening quickly enough. No. And you've got a gallery of photography is taking a punt and doing something like this because of people like Brendan and
we've done stuff for years. We were on the Keys. We used to work with McQuillan a lot. We showed exhibitions in the early 90s, static antibodies, and things like that. So there's always been a bit of queer programming in the gallery. But actually, because we've been very small up to now, things pass. And everything's in flux, and it's actually now, as we kind of want to capture this history and as we open out those intersectional histories, but also as challenges and new repressions come in again, that it's really important that this history is gathered. The arts and all these things have never had the capacity before, but we do now, and we know better now. So it's really important that we actually all lobby for these things and support activity, like in this current programme, like the National Museum, that we actively contribute to it. And I'm just wondering.
And the owners of the works too. I think the importance of collections and people's personal collections is becoming more obvious to the people who own them, and where their importance within the broader national sort of scheme.
So there's a strategy, an umbrella strategy around who collects what would be really good, because it's the same collections around who collects art. And I'm wondering, how do you collect? Like, who
And pressure from the donators.
Who's making the open call for people to share their social history? It's like we do a project here, and we're with a lot with Protestant Unionist Loyalist communities in the North, who equally aren't represented. So we do this thing called the Photograph of the Irish, and our aim is to open up to diverse representation of what it means to be Irish, held in an open archive. But if you wanted to do, LGBTQ, queer, whatever section on that, talk to Brendan, because that's about the call to what do people have in their own family albums. How do they represent their fake relationships as a cover? What's missing? So there's so much missing, and it's both official, but maybe also that social underground history is there too. So that's.
But the social history to me has enormous value because it's. For a start, because it's been so invisible, there's so much omissions, but also too, I liken it to what I call ordinary people being extraordinary. And we have the sort of formal historical narratives which relate to major figures in society. And you know what? A lot of time they're nearly all older men.
And that's usually captured, and it's usually captured in quite a dull way, the official picture.
Totally.
It's bits in between that don't necessarily take a box from an official history point of view, that often gets lost, that often tells you an awful lot more.
Thank you.
Quick question. I was interested in what you said about how there came a point, I think, did you say around 1973, where being gay was no longer subversive, but it was sort of allowed to be commercial?
1993.
1993, okay. So which is it's very shocking. And if you, maybe you all don't agree with this, but if gay culture is now kind of acceptable and mainstream and no longer subversive, where are now the spaces for what your community centre was doing back then for whatever is subversive now? And I just remember seeing in the Dublin Inquirer this morning that an NCAD exhibition has been defunded by the National Gallery because it's criticising Aramark and direct provision and being subversive. So I'm just wondering, to boil it down, where does subversion exist now, or where can the spaces exist?
Turn around, there's Brian Keeling who's behind you. He's an artist who removed his artwork from the National Gallery. It was an artwork to do with the murder of... You want to speak about it?
Yeah, sure.
So this is... Yeah.
So I removed my artwork from the gallery with the moving of the Hirschfeld Centre to Aramark. People in provision and also people in prison service. They essentially get the calls from captive audiences. So when that was in solidarity with people who experience the provision. And you're talking about diverse spaces or where they exist. It's hard to think where they do exist in Dublin at the moment. It's especially in the context of what the Hirschfeld Centre was. It's completely different times. I mean, I would look at maybe like A4 sounds, quite transgressive, or the people involved in the small trans library, even people who are in organisations like the asylum seekers or merged, they're quite subversive in terms of racist bookman policy. So I think we need to look at other communities that are marginalised to find those kind of elements of subversion.
Subversion always exists on the margins. It's one of the reasons why I prefer going to dance clubs than bars. You're going to invariably meet a better mix of people, not most of the time, not all the time, in clubs. If a club is really fulfilling its purpose, and we're denuded of club spaces in this country, and a lot of that has to do with the commodification of the public realm. It has to do with avaricious property speculators, land banking property, and not taking a punt. I mean, some of the best gigs I've ever done, and there were social arts-based gigs, were in a warehouse down on the docks on the site of what's now the Morrison Hotel. And the only reason they were large 1,000 capacity gigs in the mid-90s, the only reason they happened was because the Paddy Dunning, who now owns the Button Factory and Temple Bar Studios, Paddy Dunning was open enough to take a punt on a gang of us and go, yeah, listen, I want to make some money to pay the bills, but actually, there's a black box, do whatever you want with the place. That's unheard of. It's absolutely unheard of. And we were able to platform site-specific art installations, video and film, live music, DJs, a cafe. I mean, it's just quite extraordinary. That sort of stuff doesn't happen with any great... there's certainly not a breadth of it happening right now. I do also think that as the social scene becomes more and more commodified, it's being denuded and it's also becoming more commodified. And as it becomes more commodified, I actually think we need something that's antithetical to that. That's a counter. We need something that's more community focused, that's not predicated, and I said this earlier on, that's not predicated on whether you can afford the entrance fee, or the clothes you're wearing, or the colour of your skin, because all of these things, in spite of equality legislation and anti-discrimination legislation, all these things, people are still slyly excluded from stuff because of their gender, because of their sexual orientation, because of their ethnicity or traveller or whatever. Mm-hmm. So I do think we have to find ways to enliven these alternative social spaces, and also not just for the type of people that they attract, but also for what is possible, what can be produced within them as well. The conversations and the actual plastic arts and everything, it's really, really important. Yeah. Will we leave it at that?
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
On behalf of the gallery, we'd just like to thank Tonie, it was fantastic, and Brendan for his amazing work on curating this section, and to all the artists who participated in this exhibition, to our own funder, the Arts Council, and Brendan, you might want to say something about your curation list?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll bring it to the last section prior. Like we discussed, these banners here are from 5 new exciting queer photographers, LGBT+. They're in this section over here, and they're just exploring new queerness nowadays, how we live our lives. There's marked differences in queer spaces, how they're photographed, the types of photographs that are created, and that's sort of significant, I believe. Just it shows that shift in lived experience of queer life from the 80s under the criminalisation to now, which is much more open and not even in queer spaces entirely, queer activity within heteronormative, generalised, outgoing stuff. I can give a quicker, more impersonal tour if people are more interested. We can go up to the space, kind of you can see photographs I can speak about them at that time.
It's gorgeous, yeah.